So let's shift gears a little. We're going to move on to previewing the new Complete Streets resources. So Dan and I are going to take point on that. Um, so just so folks know, these are linked in this part of the session on the Padlet, so you can access those. Otherwise, I will walk through how you get to all of these. So first, we have an updated Complete Streets website, which is super exciting. This is on our A to Z on iHub. You can also just type in MnDOT Complete Streets and it should pop right up. So I just wanted to walk through a couple of the key things to pay attention to with the website. So we tried to clean things up, streamline it. This content aligns very well with the handbook. So what you find in there is what you'll find in here. There's more content in the handbook itself, but they tie into each other. So we have some related sites for partners. There's great resources from Federal Highways and also through Smart Growth America. And then on this home page, and I believe this bar follows on the sub pages, there's direct links to the updated policy, and then to download the handbook, and then the PDF compiled document of all of the new case studies. So the content on the home page really is organized around three areas. One, explaining the importance of complete streets. So hoping that this serves as a way for staff to easily pull talking points or lead stakeholders or the public to understanding about complete streets. There's examples, one per every district. We're hoping to build from that, and then support, which is more the technical things that MnDOT has to offer around supporting complete streets. So I'll click into each of these real briefly. But the why complete streets are important. This is a lot of the content that we covered at the very beginning of this training. So there's content from the handbook in here around those key points about the value that complete streets provide. So number one, safety. So there's some content here around safety. We have information about transportation equity and particular user groups that we need to be paying attention to, and the cost of a car-dependent society. And we need to think about these things as we build out our streets for everybody. We often get asked about complete streets supporting local economies, especially when we get into conversations about parking. I know we do have a recent study that has some really great resource or case study examples specific to this topic in Minnesota, looking at the economic impact of complete streets in small towns. So I would encourage folks to check that out. There's a link right here on the page, but overall showing a positive impact on property taxes when compared to similar sized cities that did not have a complete streets project. And so that's a great Minnesota specific resource. And then the link to healthy climate resilient communities, providing those options for active transportation modes, sustainable transportation modes. So lots of reasons why complete streets are important. And then the examples page, I mentioned there's one per district. Many thanks to the district staff who helped pull these together. We have these compiled in one PDF document if you want to print them off and share them. Otherwise, we took that information and created a web page for each of them. They all follow the same format. We have information on the right in terms of that baseline project information. We tried to have a variety of project types. So there's definitely reconstructions in here. There's also many other types of examples in terms of types of projects. We have background information about the complete streets elements that were included as part of the project. And whenever possible, we tried to have pictures, the before and after. Those speak volumes and help people really visualize what this means. And then the themes that were applied around complete streets and background information on those. So this is a great resource. We hope to build this out over time, and many folks on this call might be contacted in the future. This third part, how we support complete streets, this will probably be used more by MnDOT staff and project partners and legislators. So this has that information about the state statute, our policy, and then also performance tracking. So we have updated information about the policy or the performance measures that we are tracking that are new. And then we have historic tracking reports that were created for the legislature that folks can look back into. And then Dan will be getting into this in a little bit here, but the transportation hierarchy tool is a newer component to our guidance. And so we pulled out some highlights of that information from the handbook. And that's included here with some background, as well as a nice table, summary table that shows those different context categories with the baseline hierarchies, and then thumbnail images. So just easy ways to share this information and reference it with partners. And then lastly, we've done some really great research around complete streets. I think there's opportunity to do more. So if folks have specific complete streets related research opportunities, let me know. It would be great to pursue more. So these are linked here and summarized for easy access. There's currently one project underway around speed impacts. So as projects are added, we'll make sure to keep this updated. The last thing on this website is we have a Gov Delivery newsletter around complete streets. So we haven't sent out a notice in a while now, but we're resurrecting this. So encourage you all to sign up for the Gov Delivery here, share this with your partners so that we can just keep that education, sharing tools, resources around complete streets. All right. So the handbook, that's the next part of what we'll walk through. So that's accessible on the Padlet. You can click on that, open it up on your screen and kind of follow along with us or click through it on that website. We've pulled out a couple of different sections and we'll walk through those in slide format for you, ones that we wanted to make sure folks saw. Before we dive into that, I just want to provide a baseline for what the handbook is all about. So I mentioned that before we had a number of resources in different spots and it was hard for staff to know like what do I reference at which point. So this is really the one-stop shop. This is the new implementation resource for our staff, and partners, stakeholders can download this and look at it as well. This really is rooted in the design principles that we already have, like context-sensitive solutions, flexible design, and the other approved plans and policies. So by no means is this a separate standalone thing that is divergent from the guidance we already have. Complete Streets is more of the umbrella that's bringing these things together. And so specific design guidance is available in those other approved places. So the other thing I wanted to reiterate too is that we have a step-by-step process with this transportation hierarchy that Dan's going to walk through and a baseline to start from. By no means is that providing a predetermined modal priority, where we go into a community and say, this is the way it is. It is a starting place for iteration and a starting place for collaboration with our staff internally and with our stakeholders externally. So we're hoping that this really provides just that better grounding for where to start from, and then provides that process to walk through and to facilitate those conversations to clearly articulate what the expectations are for the project. So the first part of the handbook, 2 through 15, is really that context information. So it's a little bit of what you saw on the web page with more content. Hopefully there's some talking points or things that you can take from that to benefit your work, talking about what complete streets are, the value they provide, and then there's also information about some of the key roles at MnDOT, especially at the district level, for how to utilize the handbook and the project transportation hierarchy tool. So I guess before I hand it over to Dan, I just want to cover a couple things related to what this is all grounded in and safety. So we heard a lot from Sonia about safe systems, and it's important to note that the updated guidance is really grounded in safety, and what we mean by that is relative vulnerability. So this is on page 16. And when we talk about relative vulnerability, it's about susceptibility to injury or death when involved in a vehicle-related crash. The new guidance snapshot on the left there, we outline what this means by general user group. So for people who walk, who are biking, who are using transit, who are driving a passenger vehicle or a freight vehicle. And we know that there's a lot of relative safety that's provided to drivers inherent in the vehicle. There's seat belts, there's airbag. You think about the speed and the mass. A lot of this we take for granted when we're in a car. But you look at that relative safety provided to people who are walking or biking, and it's a lot different, right? Sometimes you might have a helmet, grade separated infrastructure, maybe it's just paint. But when we're talking about vulnerability, that's what we mean, is that relative vulnerability to injury, and this includes people of all ages and abilities. So to reiterate what was said earlier, you don't have a safe system you don't have a safe street for your vulnerable users. If you don't have that, then you don't have a safe system or a safe street. And, there is good data around this and why it's important. So we've put a good effort into reducing motor vehicle related traffic fatalities, and we're seeing some good returns on those efforts. So if you look at the trend line on the top, the blue, you'll see that the trend line for motorist fatalities is trending down. And that's great. But unfortunately, that's not the same for non-motorist traffic fatalities that have been increasing in that same time period. One of the most recent crash facts report, the most frequent contributing factor for these non-motorized fatalities for pedestrians is darting or dashing into the roadway. And, many of the design interventions and the approach of complete streets can help create that predictability of movement for all users on the roadway to help make progress in that area of non-motorist safety. One more safety related slide. So if we unpack that data a little bit more, on the left, you see Minnesota non-motorist fatalities by geography. And we know that our rural counties continue to experience a higher traffic fatality rate than metro counties. Specific to non-motorized crashes, people walking and biking in rural Minnesota, we're seeing are more likely to be struck and killed by drivers than in our metro communities. And then looking at the omnibus survey specific to bicycling safety, when we asked people about their safety concerns, they identified things like not enough dedicated bike lanes or lack of shoulder widths. When we asked about safety for walking, both Metro and Greater Minnesota residents said their concerns were not enough sidewalks or trails. And then on the right, that chart, Minnesota non-motorist fatalities by race statewide. So we know that communities of color have suffered as a result of our transportation policies, and that's a narrative that is played out nationally, and it's also playing out here in Minnesota as well. People of color in Minnesota continue to experience a larger burden of being struck and killed by drivers than white or non-Hispanic Americans. And circled there in the red, this is especially true for Black and American Indian populations, especially as compared to others when we're looking at percent of population to percent of fatalities. So, the safety, the equity pieces when we think about geography and race, those are really important when we think about our complete streets approach and the value that it can provide. All right, I will hand it over to Dan to get into the hierarchy tool.
Thank you, Nissa.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Nissa was talking earlier, kind of giving the broad strokes overview of the new Complete Streets handbook. And one of the cool things in the Complete Streets handbook is this project-specific transportation hierarchy tool. And so I'm going to give a little bit of a deep dive on that. But before I do, a little bit of background. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are we trying to do here? What's the problem that we're trying to address? We've got several issues that are kind of converging here. We know that we need to prioritize the most vulnerable users, right? Nissa and Sonia both just said that if we don't have a safe system for our most vulnerable users, we don't have a safe system. At the same time, we know that context is important and we need to respect the values and plans and policies of our partners, our local partners, as we do this. And we've also heard from practitioners that it's hard to define and to be salespeople for making the case for complete streets and defining who gets priority, what's the most important thing. So the answer to that is, next click, please. Let's take a look at modal hierarchy and see if we can come up with some guidance. So that's what we did. This isn't new. This is an idea that's been around for a while. I think in 2008 is when Chicago did that top left modal hierarchy example. These usually take the form of this inverse pyramid type of thing, and it sets a priority for modes where pedestrians are always at top, then it's bikes or transit, depending on what you're looking at. And then vehicles, it could be freight, it could be just vehicles within. So cities have been doing this for a while. Next slide, please. One of the things that we know is that it doesn't work quite as cleanly at a state level where you're looking beyond just sort of the urban areas, right? So state DOTs have taken it a step further and introduced another dimension, which is context, right? Which is really important. So not only now do the states like Florida and Oregon have these modal hierarchies or predetermined priorities, but they also introduce context based on land use, and that's really important. Next slide, please. And we're really lucky, as Jay said earlier, that MnDOT has been sort of a leader in this area for many, many years. And so MnDOT already has land use context types. These were first presented, I want to say 2018 in the MnDOT land use context type memo that's linked in your Padlet. They were also then referenced in the performance-based practical design guidance, and they will be used and sort of carried forward in the forthcoming facility design guide. And reference is going to pick up that thread. This is a really important concept for the tool. So that's why I'm lingering here, but you can see that there are 9 transportation land use context types that are meant to cover the entire state. And they're generic, but here you can see them. What we're not going to do today is a deep dive on land use context types. That could be a class of its own, but here they are, and we are going to work with them a little bit more. Next slide, please. Okay, so enter the project transportation hierarchy tool. That is a mouthful, but this is the new guidance within the handbook. And what we're trying to do here is set forth a process to help in the project development process. If you've got a project and you're working through it, how do we define what the transportation hierarchy should be? And that's what really this is about. So there are 4 steps, and don't worry if you can't read this all at this scale because I've got a slide for each of them. But the first is project review. This is the stuff you already do. This is that upfront project legwork where you're trying to get a feel for what it's all about. What are the existing conditions? How do demographics play in? That sort of thing. The next one is the context category. So that's the slide I just had, identifying what is the land use context telling us about the transportation needs of the area. And then third step is user mix adjustments. This step is really where you have to roll up your sleeves and do the work. This is about understanding what factors and considerations exist for your project on the ground, like community engagement, right? Like talking with the locals, that would influence what that hierarchy is. And then finally, probably the most straightforward, but also the most important step is documenting it all. Documenting what your project hierarchy is and including a description of your rationale for how you got there so that that thread can connect through all the way, from planning all the way through construction. Next slide, please. So we're going to do kind of a deep dive into each of those steps. And then the next session is we're actually going to do some practice with the tool in a case study in our small group. So we're going to get to play with this a little bit. But here's the first step. It's the project review. You can see the pages in the handbook if you're following along. I don't expect you to read all the details in this table, but I want you to know that it exists because it's what provides the guidance for step 1. Next slide, please. Here are the cliff notes. So it's looking at what are the mix of users that are out there. What is the crash history? Where are there frequency or severity of crashes that we ought to be looking at? What's the existing traffic control? What do the demographic trends tell us about the area? Where are the activities that generate a need along and across our project? Next slide. And then we get into the context categories and hierarchy. And this does 2 things. We already talked a little bit about the land use context types, but in addition to that, we've added the baseline transportation hierarchy. Sonia looked at or had a slide that showed this, kind of previewed it earlier, but go to the next slide, please. We've taken each of the 9 transportation context types and come up with a baseline transportation hierarchy. This is really important to say that it's just a baseline. As Nissa said earlier, it would be a huge mistake for us to go out and say this is the modal priority for your project regardless. But this is a starting point. And it says that if we have a given context type, we have some idea of what the type and mix of users might be. Next slide, please. So this is just zooming in a little bit more on what that looks like. So for instance, if you have an urban core, you can see each of the modes. In an urban core context type, we would expect high priority for pedestrians, high for bicycles, high for transit. It's lower for automobiles and higher for freight. These baseline transportation hierarchy guidance points were developed based on relative vulnerability. So it's the safety thing that we talked about. And also kind of coming up with an expectation of the type and frequency of users that we expect given the land use that exists. So there is some rationale behind it, but it's not the end, it's the beginning. Next slide. So that gets us to step 3, user mix adjustments. This is really where we do most of the work. This is where we dig in and really understand context, looking at what plans and policies exist that could inform our project. What have the locals done? Have they studied your corridor? What are their priorities? Where are they at with some of these things that we're wrestling with? And then community engagement informs this step. What are the community vision and values, and how are they looking at it? And the outcome of step 3 is bulleting out, what potential adjustments to that baseline hierarchy might be. Next slide, please. There's guidance on how to do it. I know you can't read this, but just like with the last table, I want you to know that it exists. There are some cool matrix type things in Appendix A of the handbook. This one is neat. It has a whole bunch of resources that you should consult for each project, including links and what you'll find and how to use it. It exists and you should take a look at it. Next slide, please. But this is how that might play out. So you've got your baseline transportation hierarchy. So suburban commercial in this case, you go through the process, you do the homework, and then you identify what your suggested project-specific hierarchy might be. So in this example, there was no bus service. There were no plans for bus service to be added in the future. It's not feasible for this area. So the baseline hierarchy is recommended to change transit from medium to low. So that's kind of how that plays out. Next slide, please. And then finally, documenting it. Nissa is going to talk a little bit later today about the new Complete Streets reporting form, but this is the step at which each stage in project development we can go through and build upon and document our rationale for what we see and what we're doing. Next slide. Okay, so in the handbook, there is this table example format. And the idea here is this is just one way that you could document, but you've got urban core to begin with. You can see it's small, I get granted. You can see the baseline transportation hierarchy types, but you go in and document what you see as your project-specific transportation hierarchy. And then why? What are the bullet points you see for why you're making any changes? And what other considerations are there that you want to kind of keep with the record for this project? And it's noteworthy that this happens based on segment. So throughout a given project area, Sonia had that Mora example. There may be 2, 3 different transportation context types, transportation land use context types. So you would break that up in a given project based on segment. So your project might have 2, 3, 4 rows that look like this one. So that's a really quick overview. There's a lot to unpack there. It's a simple planning 1, 2, 3, 4 step process, but when you actually get in, digging into doing the work, there's a lot that goes into it. So I'm going to turn it back to Nissa, and then just know that in just a few minutes, we're going to have a case study exercise where we can practice with this.
Great, thanks, Dan. And before I transition, I just want to reiterate too that this process isn't like a standalone separate thing that you do. This is integrated into the steps that we already have for project planning and project development. So this is a way to, I talked about the umbrella, like document it in one place, get it considered and articulated earlier, and iterated upon and documented throughout the process. So the intent is, especially that step 1, those are things that district staff are already doing, but we're bringing it into the project earlier and making that stronger link between project planning and project management so that it all ties together through documentation. So I had referenced earlier that this applies to all MnDOT projects and that there are some exemptions. So that's detailed out on page 28 if you have that open for the handbook. Otherwise, I pulled that out here on the slide as well. So we worked on this with our policy work group and a number of consultations with subgroups. So the first category really is about the routine preventative maintenance. And a change to this language from previous is that it doesn't change the structure or layout of the road. And it also doesn't meet the ADA threshold, alteration threshold. Sorry, that's a mouthful. So there's a link there to the MnDOT ADA tech memo for more information about what that alteration threshold is. But this first one integrates better that ADA component. The second category of exemptions, the projects related to stormwater, tunnels, storm sewers, landscaping. But again, any of those projects, as long as they are not directly affecting transportation users or the layout, then they're exempt. But if they are, then it needs to be reported on. The third category, any roadside infrastructure projects that basically aren't creating significant change. So things like installing signs, cable guard replacements, those types of things you don't have to report on in the Complete Streets report form. And then last, things happening in our right of way, like replacements to fiber optic cables, transmission lines, solar panels, as long as they're not altering the layout and how transportation system users interact, they're exempt from the reporting process. So to reiterate again, because it's just good that we're all on the same page. So the project reporting process has changed to go earlier. There's been some shifts in responsibilities. So there's 3 touch points for the project reporting form. First is at planning. The intent is that project planning staff start that, fill out as much as they can given what is known at that stage in the project. And then that goes to the project sponsor for review and approval. Next is project scoping. That's when it's handed over to the project manager. They make the updates at project scoping given the new information that's available. Again, the project sponsor reviews and approves. And then last touch point is at 30% final design, and those responsibilities carry on with the project manager and project sponsor. Mentioned performance measures a couple of times, so there's more detail provided on those, page 31 of the handbook. So we're tracking both process and outcome performance measures. And the intent here is to make sure that we're gathering data so that we can really support project teams in applying that guidance and also be able to talk about what we're doing and the decisions that are being made and how we're supporting our communities. So this information is really meant to help facilitate process improvements. We have performance measures identified both at the MnDOT district level and agency-wide, so we can understand how we're doing it holistically, and then also we heard from districts they want to understand how they're doing compared to others and as part of the broader MnDOT. So with the policy coming over to sustainability and public health, we have some new capacity where we will support this process and support annual progress reports, both for district leadership and the senior leadership team. So that will start next year. We're still looking at the timing. And this is meant to be a checkpoint and opening to conversations about what's working, what's not working, so that we can continue to improve the work that we're doing. So process measures, we need information to report on. So we want to make sure that all of our eligible projects have completed a Complete Streets project report. So that's something we're tracking. And then we'll also be tracking project sponsor approval to make sure that we know the right folks are seeing all of these reports at the right times. In terms of outcome measures, these are measures that are linked to safety and multimodal use and that have been identified in aligned plans at MnDOT. So bicycling improvements, that is in the statewide bicycle plan. We're looking for the annual percentage of our projects that have identified a need that are including those needs, so tracking that progress. And we do have a target in place that may change with updates to the bicycling plan, and we'll track that. We have the new statewide pedestrian system plan. So it's an opportunity for us to leverage the Complete Streets project reporting process to start tracking some of that information. So we have an opportunity to track equitable walking improvements. So we'll be looking at the pause implementation, or those priority areas for walking. So when I show the updated form, you'll see there's a check mark in there. And then safety improvements. There's safety countermeasures identified by federal highways, and also some overall project improvements that are important for MnDOT to track. So we have that included in the form. That's just an update to existing project improvements that we had been tracking before. And then the last one, which we've talked about a bit already, is just being able to meet user needs. So we have a specific section for pedestrians, bicyclists, transit users, and freight users to understand what those current needs are, and if our projects are able to meet those needs, and if not, why, so that we can, again, be looking at just our overall process and understand what those challenges are so we can make improvements. The last thing I wanted to highlight here in this section about resources is the new SharePoint site. So this is available on the iHub A to Z. If you go to Complete Streets, there's a link right there. Otherwise, I would encourage folks to visit it and bookmark it. So this is a huge upgrade from what we had before. Before, we just had a holdover SharePoint site that had a list of all of the projects. This is a way for us to consolidate things for easy access internally. So this welcome image doesn't click onto anything, but if you dive into these other two sections, there's resources. So Complete Streets Project Reporting. This is where you'll find all the information you need to understand the reporting requirements and to actually do the reporting. So again, important to bookmark this. This first quick link is actually a link to the new project reporting platform, which I'm not going to get into a ton here. I'll just kind of preview it. We're going to I'll provide an overview of the functionalities of this, and we'll practice filling it out after our small group breakout. And then there's a how-to document. So if you're questioning, different drop downs or resources, that's available. And then pulled out sections from the handbook that would be particularly important related to reporting responsibilities, that project exemption list, and then also the list of performance measures. This area also is where I'll be posting those annual reports, so folks have easy access to that and can readily see how are we doing and pull that information. So this will be built out over time. And then this bottom right-hand section, Complete Streets Resources. This has some of the same information that's available on the website, but we wanted to have it on the SharePoint site as well. So if you're already in here doing the reporting work, you can easily pull open these documents. So we have the handbook, the policy, and then that compiled resource of case studies. And then in the next few weeks here, we'll also have a recording, an edited recording of this training. So if you have new staff coming on, or if you wanted to go back to a section and reference something that we talked about, a recording of the training will be here kind of as an on-demand resource for you.